stand?
Either way, perhaps standing might be
Standing might be,
better for all. And
it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Andrew Kyriaco. And I have not had a chance to talk with Mr. Kyriaco at all, so this is exploratory questioning. I'll be asking some questions, and look forward to hearing the answers myself. I don't even know at what age he came or what year, so let's start with that.
Well, that's...
Could I start by asking you to describe the area of Greece that you came from? What do you remember about your village?
Well, actually, I have a surprise for you. I was born in this country on the first day within 24 hours of my arrival. When my parents arrived, I was born on Ellis Island itself. And many times I always chided my parents by telling them I knew what I was holding out for, and I didn't want to come out until I got what I wanted. They migrated here from the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean. The island of Cyprus at the time was a British Crown colony. This takes us back to 1920. I was born on September the 11th, 1920 on Ellis Island, and that was immediately after the journey my parents took with my sister, who was 2 years older than I at the time. And the island itself is a Greek island, essentially. The overwhelming population is Greek. About 80%, 75, 80% are Greek inhabitants. They talk the language of the Greeks. The remainder is predominantly Turkish. Because it was a British Crown colony, of course, there were cities that attracted the British there, but essentially the island was Greek and Turkish occupants. Right now, it's still Greek and Turkish occupants, and the struggles that took place in all the intervening years are still existing. They can't get together, they can't agree on anything, so there's a big dividing wall, and even more of a dividing wall than it was at the time I was growing up. I remember around 1936, the British aircraft had to fly over the island in order to threaten the insurrections that were taking place at that time, because they had a duty and a responsibility to quell the disturbances. Insofar as my talk this morning, as I told my grandson, James, I'm a bit at a loss as to what would have the greatest appeal to you. You'll have to forgive me, too. I have a very bad cold, and I lose my voice intermittently, but it will sustain us through the lecture, so have no fret. Jim suggested that I just start off and tell you what it was like for the son of an immigrant, because my memories are of my early childhood being one that I was exposed to a life that would have been different from that of an American boy. I was called a greaseball as I grew up. That was a vile way of telling you goddamn Greek. But essentially, really, I was raised in New York City, born and raised there, because Ellis Island is part of New York City now. At that time, I believe New York and New Jersey were fighting it out. They couldn't decide which side of the harbor it belonged to, but it's been resolved that it's part of New York City. And I was raised in the New York City schools, the public schools. I could not speak English until I was about 6 years old, because I remember going to school and not understanding English. My parents were very lovely people. They insisted that at home we had to talk Greek. And my mother would always admonish us that the reason she wants us to talk Greek is because she is sacrificing the ability to learn the language of English in order that we may hang on to some elements of our heritage. She said, however, in this country, I know you're going to learn English, and hopefully you will teach me English from time to time. So they always were for our getting an education in this country, and their highest requirement of our children, of her children, was that we do try to go to college. And the day was a very glorious one to them when I did go to college. I went to New York University, which was a private school in New York, and I graduated there and got my degree, when I was 22 years old. And as soon as I graduated, the Army snared me and had me go to boot camp. And 22 years later, when it was my 22nd birthday, was the first day I went and presented myself to the Army. Now, it was right across the harbor from Ellis Island on Governor's Island, just about 2 miles away. So I didn't think I made very much progress in the first 20 years of my life. I was in the service for about 3 years, and then I came out as a lieutenant in the United States Air Force as a navigator and a bombardier. Fortunately for me, I was in England at the time that the war was going on, but they sent me back as a student to become an air cadet and go into navigation school. And they were preparing us for the Japanese theater, so they were sending me also to Loran School at that time. We didn't know what Loran School was. And by the time they started to ship me off, I was already really being asked not to travel anymore because they think the war was over. And sure enough, the war was over. But getting back to my early childhood, my early recollections, as I told you, I recall very vividly the penalty I had to pay for not learning how to speak English. It was approaching Halloween, much as this particular time is, and this is traditionally the practice. You have festivities in school, you make Halloween masks and one thing and another. And the schools in New York are a drastic variance from the schools you see here. Our building was a 4-story building, 5-story building with a sub-basement. And the sub-basement was where the gym was the auditorium sometimes. It was a number of things. And they had these huge pillars supporting the whole building throughout the floor. So you really, even though it was a gym, you had these impairments there. But that's the way things were in those days. The floors were lovely hardwood floors. Make a long story short, they had us prepare some masks on these grocery bags. Make your own mask, and I did diligently. I followed. I saw what the others were doing, and I did the same thing. I used my own ingenuity and drew the face of a Halloween subject. It was a witch, I suppose, and they had us put it over our face and hold hands, and the music started. We danced around the floor, and then all of a sudden, whammo, I went and hit into the pillar. It knocked me down, and the music stopped. I heard the screams, and all I thought was the end of the world. I don't know what happened, but so the teacher came over, lifted up my mask, pulled it over, and pointed to the eyes. And she said, and that told me a big story. I forgot. I didn't know. She didn't say cut out the eyes to me. She mentioned it to everyone else, but from then on I realized I better try to learn English. And my entire childhood is filled with all types of recollections like that. I remember being bitten by a dog as a young child, and I was about 7 years old, 6, 7 years old, just learning. But the hospital of Roosevelt Hospital, Theodore Roosevelt Hospital, was about 4 blocks away, and poor mother, bless her heart, she couldn't speak English, so my sister had to take me to the hospital. That poor thing had taken me to the hospital so many times that they knew her and they knew me. And this time it was a dog bite. And she took me to the hospital, and she attended to everything and took me right back. She was 2 years older than I. She was 8 years old, and here she was 8, 9 years old, taking her little brother. So our ties with my eldest sister have been at that time and down through the many, many years have been extremely close, and to this day they are very close with my eldest sister because we went through so much. She herself went through a lot too because there were the cultures that were different, and we had to tread both cultures. I recall as a little girl, she was about 10 years old at the time. I was pretty proud of her because now she was breaking into the American societal affairs like birthday party and all. They're things my parents would never hear of. They didn't celebrate birthdays, they celebrated name days. My name is Andrew Kyriaco, so they celebrated St. Andrew's Day, not my birthday, St. Andrew's Day, which comes in October, and that was a big holiday at home. My father's name was Demetrius, so we celebrated St. Demetrius Day. And that was the celebration to mark your birthdays through life. She wanted to go to a birthday party that her girlfriends at school were having, and it was in the home of a neighbor 1 house away. But we didn't know those people. My mother was very adamant that she can't go to the birthday party. And my sister was very distressed over it, because here she said, well, all my friends are going to be there. It's just going to be a simple birthday party. There's nothing going to take place that you should worry about. Their mother will gladly contact you. We didn't have phones in those days, as popular as they are now. So my mother said nothing doing. A woman came over and tried to induce my mother to let my sister go. Oh, no, nothing doing. So my poor sister just couldn't go. One time when she had it up to here, that is, my sister had it up to there, she got very much distressed over the discipline that my mother was exercising over us as children. And she told my mother, she stood foot and told my mother, this is America. We have our rights. And my mother said, oh, you do have your rights? What are they? I'll tell you what they are. Wham! And frankly, that settles that as far as the children are concerned. We really had a very lovely relationship in our family. These are not unpleasant memories. We talk about them and we laugh over them, but there were little periods, little interludes that made it somewhat of a burden to us as foreigners. We were not readily accepted, even though we were Greek. We lived in a neighborhood from time to time. It was when my parents first moved into this country. My father got a job very quickly without any problem. He was a very fine shoemaker in the old country. He had his own business of making shoes. When they say make shoemaker, they meant shoemaker. He'd make boots, women's shoes, men's shoes, anything you ordered. And he was a very masterful craftsman, so he had no concern about getting a job here. He sold his store and operations in Cyprus, and they decided they just wanted to come here. And were not under compulsion to leave, because they in turn had family there. But they heard so much about America, they just felt that it's time to do it now while they were young, or they weren't going to be able to do it. And they packed their belongings, took their meager savings, came to this country with the confidence that they can do it without knowing the language, and now 2 children. And I have to admire them. All throughout my lifetime, when I was confronted with problems, I would turn around and say, well, wait a minute now, your parents had more than you ever did, so stop complaining. And it saw me through a lot of tight situations, because it gave you the courage to forge ahead. If your parents had that kind of courage, why shouldn't you?
Did you know anybody in New York before they came?
Yes, one nice thing about the group, as it was, is each one who came would help relatives and friends, whether they were relatives or not, if they came from the same village, or if they were related, or even distantly related. They congregated together, and the cooperation amongst them was phenomenal. They really were very lovely. For example, it was some relatives who had an apartment ready for my mother and father. So my mother and father were able to move right into their own apartment. They had the means to pay the rent, so that wasn't a problem. He wasn't lazy. He managed to get a job real fast, and he was a hard worker all his life. And really, the transition for them was a very comfortable one. I do remember, too, where as the time went on, we moved into larger apartments and accommodations. We were able to invite uncles. And they came and were very grateful. My father's brother, my relatives, more distant, cousins and all. And when they came to this country, you went and visited them, provided them, showed them the ropes, and helped them, looked after them until they made sure they were anchored pretty comfortably, and they never forgot those things. But it was a wholesome feeling, not one of obligation or commitment or what's in it for me or things like that. It was a very wholesome spirit and a feeling, the likes of which I honestly say I don't find around me, sad to say. Even when I came to California as an American from one end of the world to the other, I did not find that same spirit of wholesomeness and sincerity that you found in those days. And they lived closer together. So you had a big community of Greeks and a Greek grocery store and a Greek market. And as long as you knew how to go from one to the other and all, even your food and your provisions were substantially the same. And then when you got to know things like my mother, even though she never became greatly conversant in English, she began after all those years to get enough of a smattering of the language that she could practically do anything in New York City and never had a problem. Even the subways, if she was going to go from our home from the Bronx, let's say, all the way downtown to go shopping at Macy's, she knew where on the subway platform the train that stopped in front of the subterranean entrance for Macy's would be. So she'd go to that particular car, which may have been the 9th car on the 10-car subway train, and knew which store to walk out of in order to walk right into Macy's. So she knew her way around. She became sophisticated in that regard, and it was an interesting time. It was indeed.
Can I ask you a couple other questions? The
Please.
people in your neighborhood, were they mostly from Cyprus, or were they from Greeks from all over?
No, they were essentially Greeks from all over. They weren't just the Cypriots. The Cypriots did not have that big a colony that it did have in New York. They did have a Cyprian club. There was enough of a population there that they had one that serviced the whole city, and that was essentially more for the men to go and play backgammon and play cards and sit and chit-chat and compare notes, or if they're looking for a job, one would communicate with the other. They had the hometown newspapers because you normally couldn't afford to subscribe to those things. And they kept together that way, and then if you wanted to, you could still go to the Greek club, which was different from the Cyprian club. And then, of course, each center, each community of Greeks had their own little gathering group. And you'd know the Astoria Club were those from Kefkira, and those from here were for Chios and different islands and what have you. So once they became acquainted with the city, then they began to congregate into the more closer ties that they had. But they never, and I have to say this, they never had a feeling that their loyalty wasn't to the United States. Right then and there, my father, I remember, telling me time and again, this is America, and you have to remember that we are Americans, because that's the one thing he wanted, is his citizenship papers, and he got them, and he was so very, very proud of them. And we all were very, very proud of him. And like that, my sister, who was an English citizen because she was born on the island of Cyprus, she was an English citizen. Now she had the rights to become an American citizen. And right away went and got her papers as an American citizen because her father now was an American citizen. And she was under 2 years old. And at that time, the law permitted a child who was born and was under 2 years old, they came to this country to live, they automatically would become an American citizen if the parents were American citizens. So they're the thoughts and memories that go endlessly on. But if you have any questions or comments or inquiries, please make them, and I'd be more than glad to elaborate on them instead of just drifting in the fashion that I have been.
I was going to ask you if you had any memories of the Depression?
Oh, yes, very much so, very vivid memories. We walked to school. There was, in fact, in the whole block where we were, well, let's face it, New York City didn't have very many cars in those years. I'm going back, let's say, around 1929, 1930, 1933. there weren't very many cars. The people who had cars were mostly professional people who had to get around town, and the subways wouldn't get you there that quickly unless you had a single destination. But if you had 3, 4 visits and going dashing across the city, then a car was rather necessary. And the only people who had it on our block were the professionals. And the professionals was one man. And I remember he had a Ford, and he was so nice. He let us ride in his Ford, and we just used to think it was the cat's meow dangling out of all the windows. And
Was he quick also?
no, he wasn't. He was Irish. And in New York at that time, everyone working in the subways was Irish. You had cliques. The cliques were in different areas working. The police department was Irish. And they were really, you felt no animosities or anything. You loved them because they were very nice people. We were taught to feel that we were protected by the police and by the fire department and by the various civil servants. So to us, a policeman was a friend. The policeman around the block, he'd walk around the block. He practically knew all of us, if not by name. He knew where we belonged. And his discipline was just seeing him walking by, then you behaved yourself a little differently. If it was hot in the city, you didn't open up the fire pumps. And in the summertime, throw a barrel over it and start sprinkling and running underneath the shower with your bathing suit on. You waited until he left the area and you did that, so at least the next time he came around was 45 minutes later. But, you know, it was a delightful period. You asked about the Depression. I remember walking to school every single morning during the Depression. The schools at that time felt that a lot of children weren't having any food. So one thing that they did is they started giving a glass of milk each morning at 10 o'clock and 2 little cookies that were these Oreos, chocolate. To this day, the memories of Oreos is a very, very fond one. We still have them in the house. And they give us those 2 Oreo cookies. Of course, they didn't know nutrition, I'm sure, at the time too much, but they gave you your milk, and they give you the Oreos, and that was just for the purposes of nutrition. And in going to school, this was the part that was tragic to me. It brought tears to me at that time. I'd walk along the street, and you'd see people moving furniture out on the sidewalk. And sometimes you recognized whose home the furniture was coming from. It was your friend, it was your next door neighbor, the neighbor down the street, but there were at least 2, 3 families in the 4-block walk to school who had all their furniture taken out of the apartment and piled up in the street because the people couldn't pay the rent. And in those days, there were no laws about that. If you didn't pay your rent, you were out. And they didn't have to have an eviction notice or anything. They just walked, the landlord went in and had some goons, I call them goons, some men take the furniture and carry it out and put it out on the street. And all your furniture was out there, and the children, the family was sitting on the couches and chairs just crying because they didn't know what to do. But neighbors normally would put out a hat on the couch or one of the chairs, and passerbys would drop money in. And when we were coming back from school, we were just praying that there was enough money raised so the furniture wouldn't be out on the street. And what a delight it was when you walked by and you saw that the furniture was no longer there. You liked to have assumed that it went back into the house, and really that's exactly what was going on. A lot of people, too, started to sell apples, 5 cents an apple. They were the people who couldn't find a job. They were not lazy people. They wanted to prove to you that they don't mind working, so they stayed out in the cold, no matter what the weather was, selling apples or chestnuts or whatever was appropriate, just to be able to raise some money. You bought the apple for 5 cents because it cost him probably a penny. Things were much, much cheaper than they are now. 5 cents was a lot of money to pay for an apple, so you knew you were giving a donation, a contribution during that period. Yes, my dear.
Did you marry a Greek woman, and do your children and grandchildren speak?
Oh, now you touched the sore spot. My parents, my mother particularly, my father was smart. He would stay quiet and let mother do the talking. And mother would always insist that we marry a Greek girl. I marry a Greek girl, my sisters marry a Greek man. And that was something they always wanted me to do. And I was always scheming, conniving in ways of trying to let them know that I wasn't going to be bound by that, but I didn't want to hurt their feelings. I loved them too much to hurt their feelings. And I'd turn around and tell them, well, show me one who has the same enthusiasm for education, for career, and this and that. I said, because I'm not just going to marry a Greek girl just because she talks Greek. What good is that going to do me? I can speak English, and if she can speak English, we'll get along. But, you know, that was just a little repartee between the family. But I did marry an American girl, as you would say. She was a girl that I met when I was here on the West Coast. I was some 30 years old, 33 years old when I met and married her. And I sent an invitation to the folks just 1 week before the wedding because I didn't want to have any problems. But I called them up and told them I want to get married and I wanted to invite them for the wedding. And of course, mother took it rather hard from what I understand, but that wasn't, there wasn't any animosities, vindictiveness, nothing along those lines. And the report from my brother-in-law, the next time I heard from him, is all your dad did, he said, is he slapped his hand on his knee like that. He says, that's my son. So there, you see, he'd tell you one thing, but there was a pride in knowing that there was that element of independence. Yes, they did mention, and it was very important to them, that we do stay within the Greek culture so we could pass it on to our children. Well, I didn't. Consequently, my wife does not speak English. But I will have this to tell you is when my parents came here, they fell in love with her. And my mother, time and again, with tears welling in her eyes, she would turn around and say, son, I know I gave you a rough time, but I couldn't have asked for a lovelier daughter-in-law. I love her as much as I love my other daughters. And that was a true compliment because now my wife is a very fine Greek cook. She cooks every bit as nice as my sisters do and competes with recipes, exchanges recipes. So really she's every bit of a Greek. She married me in a Baptist service because she was of the Baptist denomination at the time, and she couldn't elicit a reaction from me. But she began to worry as to whether or not I considered myself married because I didn't marry in the Greek Orthodox Church. And when she asked me, how come you're not annoyed? I said, well, honey, I think it's too much for me to ask you to start learning your Greek catechism and studying because they will not accept you in the Greek Church very readily unless you become very conversant with the Greek faith. And that bothered her. And one particular time, she called me up and told me that she was baptized in the Greek church. And I couldn't believe it. And I went to the church, the father, and he told me that he knew she wanted to get married so ardently that he didn't have the heart not to spend time with her, versing her on all the minimal requirements of the church so she could marry in the Greek church. So she was married, she was baptized, which then qualified her to get married. So then we had to have a Greek wedding. And here my children were 5, 6 years old. So they went to the wedding, and the next day we heard from his school. What had happened is they had show and tell. And my eldest boy was then about 7 years old. They asked him, what did he do over the weekend? He says, oh, I went to Mother's wedding. My mother and father got married. So
Well, let's see, that was about 1953 when you first married. Was the Greek Orthodox Church still using the Greek language? They were not, were they?
Yes, they were using the Greek language. In fact, the Greek language just, the English language started to come in to being quite a few years after World War II. Because I remember when I was in London, I was very grateful for being there, because when I went to the Greek Orthodox Church in London, lo and behold, they had a very fine Greek dictionary, which I could never find in the United States. The American Greek dictionaries in the United States were less than scholarly efforts. I had them, but they never satisfied me. But when I saw a Greek-English dictionary there, I knew that the English were way ahead of us in those things. So I brought some of those books back with me. And it was since, I'd say, the late 50s when they really started to have liturgies in both Greek and English, and they interspersed them. And they had to be very, very careful there, because a lot of the old-timers then became very difficult. And in some instances, there were schisms in the church, within the church, because the old-timers who really contributed towards the building of the church and all, now they felt they were being pushed to the side. Anybody else have any questions? Yes?
It seems that the church and religion was very important to you in your life.
Yes, very definitely. Really, your life evolved around the church. All the high holidays were outstanding holidays to a Greek. Easter was really what I would consider the highest holiday, were it not that I was a child. Easter would have been the most sacred, but the most lavish holiday we would have. My mother would prepare for it well in advance. Now, mind you, Easter meant we had to fast for 40 days, and fasting was very difficult for us, especially in the American culture. That meant we could not eat, and that meant just that. We could not eat anything that was derived from a dairy product or a living creature. You couldn't eat milk products, you couldn't eat cheese, you couldn't eat. It was very limited to essentially vegetables, bean soup, lentil soup, all. To this day, I'm sure there are elements of impact that they have left with me. But we survived them. I used to get very difficult sometimes. And one time I remember pulling the shades down and telling Mother, well, now no one can see us. Why don't you give us some meat? And oh, she thought I was being sacrilegious. And Father turned around and said, well, honey, he was telling Mother, ease up a little. And so she would discuss things with the Father, and they would ease up a little and let us have what we called nourishment. We were thinking they were trying to starve us, whatever. But the church itself was a very close thing to us. I had to go to church during Easter because I was the oldest male, and everybody could have an excuse, but there was no excuse for the oldest male not to go. I was maybe 9, 10 years old, but what you don't know is the service was about 4 hours long. And when you went as a youngster at 8 o'clock in the evening, right after dinner, and you had to stay on your legs until 10, 12, 1 o'clock, depending on the service, it really was very, very arduous, because the old-time priests, they were unrelenting. You just stood there, and if you tried to walk out, you would be embarrassed, because he would turn around and have people posted there that would send you right back in. And the women stood on one side of the church, and the men stood on the other. If my mother went to church with us, she had to stand on the left-hand side, and the men stood on the right-hand side, and that's the way it was. So you were separated, so you couldn't lean on your husband or anything like that. And we didn't have chairs in those days either. You stood. That's all there was to it. There were no pews to sit in. Since that time, the church has changed and I think adopted certain characteristics that are very welcomed. When I visited Greece in the 1970s, I was glad to see that we had more pews than they did. But speaking of the holidays, as I told you, the name days were very important. And there were days like St. Demetrius were very important in the culture. So you didn't have to have a St. James. Though the name James is so common, you probably had 3, 4 relatives that were celebrating that day. So you would either jump to a few of their parties that they were having that day and gravitate from one to the other. You got together and tried to have the parties all together. But you did have very nice affairs there, social events that the children weren't set aside. They were part of it. I remember many a time, you know, they would drink and be merry and all, but I honestly have to admit that if in my whole lifetime I saw more than 2 or 3 Greek people drunk, that's an exaggeration. I don't remember the display of liquor consumption that I see in this day and age. I myself have been drinking ever since I was a young kid. I remember, and my father was doing this to us with calculated intent. You know, we'd have wine on the table at all times. He'd have wine on the table. It was even when we were children. And one time when I volunteered to have a glass of wine, he says, "Sure, son, you're going to be a man. You may as well learn how to drink now." And he poured me a little thimble of wine. It was at least an ounce of wine, but to me it was a full glass, you know. And he says, "Drink, go ahead, drink and be a man." And that's the way he put it. My sisters, they backed away. They wouldn't let my sisters drink. But it wasn't that they were going to stop them. No, because mother could drink. But mother would exercise discretion, so the daughters exercised that discretion. And I was brought up with liquor all around me. And the only sad incident I know is when my sister was about 4 years old. She was very, very thirsty. And one time when she's gathering, it was on my father's name day, St. James Day, St. Demetrius Day, they were the festivities and the confusion. You could understand a child gets overlooked. So as to not be difficult, my sister went to the table and took what she thought was a glass of water and drank it. And what it was really was ouzo. Now ouzo is as bad as vodka. And what she did is she took a glass that was partially filled, poured it in, got a little more here and a little more there, and she drank it. And it tastes like licorice. Delightful, but powerful. And they had to rush her to the hospital because they couldn't understand her actions or anything, and they were frightened. And they took her to the hospital. They had to, fortunately, we were very close, a block away, you see, so they pumped her, and I remember crying all night long because we didn't know if she was going to live or anything like that, but the next day she was up and around. Sometimes I wondered why they did it, but now you know, sometimes as sisters and brothers you get angry with one another, but you never wish that kind of harm on anyone. But she pulled out of it, and that's a story she remembers very well. She remembers the ordeal she went through. But the church, as I started to mention to you in New York City, at that time there was only one church that I remember, and that was the Cathedral on 72nd Street in New York City. The city was such a small development stage at that time, but now I'd say New York City probably has about 15 churches, Greek churches, so you could understand how awesomely the population of Greeks have grown. They even have their own community in Astoria, Long Island, where you can get the local Greek newspaper, and you could get any local Greek dishes or commodities or records or anything you want. And then downtown New York City on 8th Avenue, they used to have all the novelty shops where you can get your Greek Christmas cards, Easter cards, whatever. I mean, anything you wanted in New York you could get. And I'm sure you still can.
Well, the community you moved into, was there a lot of racial mix between the...
Well, when I was 9 years old, we moved away from the community that I would establish as having had ethnic ties. We didn't do it with calculated intent to get away from it because it was very dear to us. But we felt that, my parents felt that they wanted to get us into a better community, into nicer schools, and with an element that would permit us to advance in life. So we moved to the Bronx, which at that particular time was a very nice area. And it was a Jewish community. We blended in with the Jewish community. I didn't realize it was Jewish until after you settled down. And it was a thoroughly Jewish community. I would say in the entire block, if there were 10,000 people, you know, you could say there probably were 10,000 people in one city block. Of the 10,000 people, maybe there were just about 15 families that were not Jewish. And we were one of those families. We blended very well.
There was no tension between the...
None whatsoever, none whatsoever. I experienced tension and gangs, what you called gangs at that time, as a youngster, when I lived in Amsterdam Avenue in New York City, which is where I spent most of my early years, up to 9 years old. In that particular area of town, it was essentially Polish, Italian community with a number of Greeks, a sprinkling of what we call a lot of Greeks, but that's all there were at the time. And you found a number of various ethnic groups. Irish were there too. They were all over the city. And you got along pretty nicely. However, amongst the boys, each block seemed to have become difficult to trespass over if you weren't with your own group of friends, or going or coming from school. When you were going to school or coming from school, you never had a problem. But lots of times if you were caught in their block, they would turn around and give you a rough time. And by rough time is one particular time I remember. I was down in the street playing. Then all of a sudden I recognized these boys coming from across the street, which wasn't our neighborhood, but I was the only one from my block. And they came, and one of them had a lead pipe at the end of a wire or a rope, and he was just circling it like this, you know, and walking towards me. And I knew what that was all about, but I was greatly outnumbered, and there was nothing for me to do except to try to defend myself. And when he was approaching me with that pipe, I knew if I put out my hand, it had broken my wrist, one thing and another. To make a long story short, an elderly person saw them doing that and started to divert their attention. And when he diverted their attention, I was able to try to defend myself a little more capably, but I nevertheless got the pipe hitting me straight in the temple, and that reverberation I will never forget. But that made me extremely mad, and I started kicking and fighting like the devil, and they all ran away as soon as the man let his voice up, so I couldn't snare any of them, but I remembered one of them a few days later. And I'm sorry to say this is an episode that disturbs me, but I never did it again, so I don't feel bad. But I caught him in my neighborhood. And I was so incensed with emotion that I remember taking his head. I mean, I pinned him down. I was able to control him because he didn't have a lead pipe. So I took him and put his head right underneath the wheel of a car that was parked. Because I saw the driver get in on the other side, I was waiting for the car to move along, and someone came and stopped me. So, but you see, your vengefulness was beyond reason. And I was ashamed of that episode. As time went on, I was glad someone stopped me, because that would have been...
What ethnic group did that boy come from?
Pardon?
What ethnic group was that gang?
It was the next block.
And
Whatever
was-
the group. They could have been the Irish, the Polish, whatever.
But
it
each
was
had
the
its own
block.
gang.
Yeah, they had their own gang. It was an informal gang. The only mischief we ever would do, and I didn't participate in it, because most of the people around there knew me and they knew my family, so my mother and father would hear of it instantly and would hurt them. But what they would do lots of times, they'd get together and they'd go to, in those days, the produce shops had a stand outside and all the lovely fruits were out there. The meat shop, the poultry shop was a store where they sold live chickens, and they had vats of boiling water. So you go and select your live chicken. They take the chicken, dunk it in the boiling water, feather it for you, and give it to you to take home. And that was the meat at the poultry shop. In the vegetable shop, the kids would run right by, steal the apples, 1 or 2 apples, but when they pull the wrong ones, the whole thing starts rolling down. And that's when the caretaker would get annoyed. And then he'd grab whoever he could grab. And if I were anywhere in the vicinity, I would be associated with that, and I didn't dare to. But those are the little petty thefts that kids did that were essentially the most violent things, other than the boys being violent with one another. But winter time, there was a hill that we would sleigh ride down, but it took you down, straight down to the railroad tracks near the Hudson River. And you had to be careful because there were like 6, 7 tracks, and there were very busy railroad lines. So you used to try to beat the trains while you were going down there, and you took it as part of what life was. I remember skating, and skating in New York was pretty rough because you had no place to play. But one nice thing that you used to be able to do is grab a hold of a vehicle that was taking off and hide, and he would take you along. And then when you thought the speed was getting out of hand, you'd let go and hope you could meet the lights and the various situations without... the thing that cured me of that is I did see a friend, I shouldn't say a friend, but a buddy that went to school with me. He was riding on a streetcar. And he was riding on a streetcar on the inside where the 2 trains were coming and going. And unfortunately, a poor kid, I don't know what had happened, either the swaying of the trains. Normally you had good clearance, but apparently the 2 cars swayed in together and it ripped off one ear, and he was bleeding there. And it just was very traumatic to me. And at that time was when I swore I wish that something could be done with ambulances, because it took them over an hour to come and the boy was dead before the ambulance came. But that was the life in the city. Then they started eliminating the bumpers and the step rails that they had in automobiles, so you couldn't sneak rides anymore. You used to hold on the handlebar on the side of an automobile and ride the tread that you had, the step, and hide. But now you couldn't do it. They streamlined the cars. So there was a life that we look back with reflection and some joy and pleasure. And it's surprising. I never thought of the tragic sides until we're talking just now. But there was a lot of tragedy. That a friend of ours was playing stickball on the roof. And someone hit a fly ball, and he went to catch it, but he went over the roof. You see, that's the thing, that when you did things that you weren't supposed to do, you paid a penalty, and the penalty was finality. That was it.
You mentioned that you always assumed that you would be going to college. Your parents stressed it.
Yes. Oh,
Did they
yes.
have the same goal for your sisters?
They attempted to have the same goals for my sisters, but one thing they realized is that to send me to college was an overwhelming expense to them, and they couldn't afford to do it for my sisters. So they concentrated on me, but at the same time, and this is a point that you're raising that's very interesting, at the same time they considered me as the head of the family to be. So it was very important that I commit myself to looking after my sisters at all times. I was never to marry until all my sisters were married, and that was a very understood thing, and I abided by it. I gave my commitment to my parents that I would do that because I was raised with that feeling of dedication. And one of the things was to make yourself as good a breadwinner as you could be because you were assuming an awesome responsibility.
Did your parents follow the Greek tradition of saving up for a dowry for their daughters?
Yes, they attempted to save money for my sisters, but we were fortunate in the sense that some of the American traditions seeped in. And when they fell in love with men who were capable of supporting them without any concern about a dowry. Although those that did attempt to consider dowry, they never got to first base to begin with because they were another type of an element. And that's when I went off to war. My parents didn't know whether I ever would come back alive, but they did want one assurance from me, was that in the event that I came back and was capable of it, would I look after my sisters in case they weren't there. And true to my heritage, I did not marry until after all my sisters were married.
Your father was a skilled craftsman in Greece, but he came to the United States where shoemaking was already automated. What did he find to do?
No, it wasn't automated to the extent that the good shoes were handmade. And he got a job with Miller, which was one of the finest shoes and very expensive. When I was a kid, I couldn't understand how people could afford to pay that kind of money for those shoes. But they loved him at the plant there because he was an excellent craftsman, and he was making Miller shoes by hand. And they did it for the longest time. When they stopped doing it by machine, that's when he went into shoe repairing and opened up his own store and did shoe repairing and worked until he was 72 years old and then quit.
He was literate?
Pardon?
He was literate in Greece? Could he read?
Yes, oh yes. He read and write. He read and wrote in Greek, and he picked up Turkish, reading and writing, only because he was exposed to Turks on the island. He came to this country. He learned how to read the newspaper by looking at the New York Daily News, looking at the pictures and associating the pictures with the words. So he learned English that way. And when he was at Miller, they were all Italians, so he learned Italian fluently. And he could curse with the best of them. But,
did your mother read and write in Greek?
Yes, my mother read and wrote in Greek. And they came from families that were rather comfortable. But on my father's side, we inherited nothing from any of them, because although my grandfather was a wealthy person, when his parents died and they left him his fortune, he lived off his fortune. So by the time he died, when he was 85, 86 years old, they were broke. So he didn't have any. And my mother's side, he left a nominal inheritance to the family, to the children, when he passed away. But it was a family that really considered education a very important thing. And no one could make any noise while I was studying in school, coming home from college. Now, I'll tell you, college was not easy for me, because while they were willing to pay for the tuition, it was full tuition, and in those days it was a lot of money. It was some $760 for a quarter semester. And that was a lot of money for us to raise. And I had to go to work, and I was working 38 hours a week on weekends. On Friday night, from school, I would go straight to work until midnight. All of next day, I'd work on Saturday about 12 hours a day, and on Sunday about 14 hours a day. Then I'd go home on Sunday night and do the homework of the weekend. And I might go to bed 3 o'clock in the morning, but I got up the next morning to go to class, all through high school and college. 4, 5, 6 solid years. And that was an arduous ordeal, but we survived it. And like to think was all the better for it. I studied accounting in college at New York University, and it was a renowned school in that field. And when I graduated from there, I went to apply to Harvard for the simple reason that Harvard had a very beautiful name, and I figured I wanted a master's degree from Harvard. I got a very nice letter from the school dean of the business graduate school, and he wrote me a letter in which he told me, he said, "You have a very phenomenal background in accounting, and you're welcome to come here. Your credentials are excellent, but we are confused as to what your purpose would be because we have nothing better to offer you." So he said, "You're welcome to come." So I figured, why should I waste my parents' money and spend more time just to get a degree? But at the same time, I could tell you the degree from the school that you could get, like Harvard, would have meant much, much more. But I was fortunate. In New York City, NYU had a very fine reputation. Both City College, the City College of New York, and NYU had a very fine reputation in that regard. But,
Well, we've kept you a whole hour here, and it's been absolutely fascinating. Any last question that anybody wants to raise?
well, yes.
Do you still speak Greek or have you put up?
Well, I'll tell you, when I speak Greek now, which is about once every 9 months, my brother-in-law laughs and laughs and laughs. He's very fluent. He's a graduate of a naval academy in Greece, so he's a scholar in Greek, and he just laughs at me. I can get along with family and other people, but if I'm around them, now you let me go to Greece for 1 week. In 1 week's time, the people in Greece wouldn't know that I was from America. They have told me that. But when I first arrived there, I'm lost. I don't remember the words, but they come back very rapidly. As soon as I hear them, they come back to me very rapidly.
You know, when you were getting your education and working, really hard as you did, and although it was really hard, do you feel that you owe a lot of what you are now? Do you feel that you benefited and made you better for it?
Oh, of course, very definitely. It exposed me to adversities that I have experienced before. So to me, it's something that was good for me during the war, when you were ready to throw up your hands. It was good for me through navigation school, where they told you that you're sitting for your final exams, and they warned you that in your final exams in navigation, now mind you, navigation is a very complicated process of trigonometry and what have you. Not this present day when you have all these computer gadgets. You had to go to logarithms and tables and trigonometric functions and sextants.
You had to be the computer.
You had to be the computer. And the instructors were walking up and down. I swear this to you. They were walking up and down with pots and pans and banging them, and then walking by you and going like this. And you had, because they tell you, what do you expect in an airplane? That's what's going to happen. You're going to be jostled about and everything. So if you dropped your books, that's your problem. You have to pick it up. And so you ask me, were you better suited? That's all those things made me tolerate that. I don't think I could have done it. I would think I would have taken a swing at the instructor at that point.
Well, thank you so much. This gives us a wonderful insight.
Thank you for having me.